Grateful Dead.
Tell me all that you know, and I can tell the future. There you go. Bring me the good to me. I guess it doesn't matter.
Welcome to the Grateful Dead Hour. I'm David Gans. This week you're going to hear about a new CD that I produced for Grateful Dead Arista Records titled Postcards of the Hanging. Grateful Dead perform the songs of Bob Dylan. The disc features 10 live performances of Bob Dylan songs by the Dead, plus one song from the rehearsals for the 1987 Dylan Dead tour with Bob Dylan singing Man of Peace. Rolling Stone gave the album 3.5 stars in a review by music editor David Frick. There's a new record out called Postcards of the Hanging. The Grateful Dead perform the songs of Bob Dylan, but since I produced it, I can't exactly interview myself about it, so I've invited Gary Lambert, editor of the Grateful Dead Almanac, to conduct this interview. Hello.
David, Postcards of the Hanging is a project that's been bandied about for some time.
I did a 3-part Grateful Dead Hour series several years ago of all of the Dead's Dylan covers, and at that time I pitched it to Grateful Dead Records as a project. It actually, as things tend to do in that world, took a little while to actually come to fruition, but it did indeed, and here it is.
And the research and development on the album, other than the compilation you did a few years ago, you also had a fair amount of advice and consent and kibitzing from your friends in the Dead taping community and the online world, I believe.
Yes, indeed. These things are always better when they're passed through many sets of ears. There's a lot of people in this world who know this music well. People who love Bob Dylan and people who love the Grateful Dead, and people like me and you who love both Bob Dylan and the Grateful Dead. So there was no shortage of opinions and suggestions, and it's sort of silly to imagine one person listening to every known version of a given song, especially ones that were in the repertoire for so long. So I asked around and asked people what their opinions were. In the Well, where you and I both hang out, there has long been a conference full of discussions about the best versions of various songs. So I started there, but I spoke to the fellows who contribute to the Deadheads Taping Compendium, and checked over on DeadNet and asked for opinions there. So there were a lot of different people throwing ideas into this pot. And of course, David Lemieux, the archivist in the vault, has very, very big ears, and he came up with a lot of suggestions that wound up being the final ones.
There's a certain point in this winnowing process where you get it down to one version or another. And a famous decision-making quandary in Grateful Dead is recording quality pristine, but performance has a few glitches in it, or incredibly incendiary performance. But there are always trade-offs. How do you get to that point where you say version A over version B?
Ideally, you want to have both really great performances and really well recorded performances. You can't always have both, but we chose stuff largely from the late 80s because A, that's when the greatest density of Dylan tunes was happening, but also because there were a lot of multi-track recordings from that time, and there were some pretty high quality soundboard tapes being made in that period. So we had a fairly decent pool of high-grade recordings from which to choose. And the hard part really is catching that perfect performance. And by perfect, I don't mean absolutely note perfect, not a thing out of place, but where there aren't any major stumbles over lyrics and stuff. Because with Bob Dylan tunes, the lyrics are the thing, and if you leave out a line, you leave out a verse, it definitely affects the overall thing. We did wind up using a version of Desolation Row that is missing a verse. And the one that we wanted to use, the sort of consensus choice about Desolation Row, was December 31st, 86. But the recording of it This was really Joe Gastwert's call. When I got to L.A. with all the tapes, and Joe Gastwert, who's a stone deadhead, by the way, although I'm not sure the industry knows that about him.
And a brilliant mastering engineer, we should point out to those who don't know.
When we got everything into the machine and started listening to it in context, Joe made the call and said, this just isn't happening. The recording was just a little washed out sounding compared to the rest of the stuff. Jeffrey Norman did these fantastic mixes of 5 of the tunes for the main CD. And in that context created by those great recordings, the 123186 was just lacking a lot. It was kind of mushy in the middle. So we put an emergency call in to David back up in Novato, and he went through and pulled out a bunch of versions that our notes told us were good and sent them down to us. And Joe and I listened to them very carefully the next day. And then we called up there and said, well, the one we want to use is 32490. And Jeffrey Norman kicked the trichromes out of the studio, I think, and mixed it for us, on very short notice, which was very much appreciated.
Dr. Phil, he keeps his world inside of a leather cup. And all his sexless patients, they're all trying to blow it up. Now his nurse, some local loser, she's in charge of the cyanide hole. And she also keeps the cards and reads, have mercy on his soul. They all play on the penny whistle. Yes, you can hear them blow. Far enough on Desolation Road.
It isn't perfect. Phil stumbles over a line, I think, in Just Like Tom Thumb's Blues. But we wound up with stuff that works really, really well, and particularly the stuff that was mixed from multi-track. Just fantastic sounding performances. The All Along the Watchtower that David suggested is just incendiary.
Yeah, that was often a blow the roof off the dump number at countless Dead shows.
All Along the Watchtower, from a new CD titled Postcards of the Hanging, Grateful Dead perform the songs of Bob Dylan, produced by yours truly. I'm being interviewed by Grateful Dead Almanac editor Gary Lambert.
You had Bob Weir's ears for some of this. You sent him some versions of the tunes, and he gave some feedback, didn't he?
Yes, indeed. Bob was very much supportive of this project and took an active part in making the selections. I did most of the narrowing down and got things down to 2 or 3 versions of various songs, and then gave him CDs of those. There were some decisions that had to be made. There wasn't room on the single CD for every Grateful Dead cover. So I sort of decided arbitrarily somewhat that Stuck Inside a Mobile with the Memphis Blues Again and Queen Jane Approximately were sort of either or. And I went with Stuck Inside a Mobile because it's a little more upbeat, and we needed more brisk tempo stuff because this is a very ballad-heavy record. And just in terms of real estate, Knocking on Heaven's Door would have eaten up 2 slots. You know, it's such a long tune, especially the best versions of it just go on for a while. So I had to make some decisions about what not to use, and Bobby was totally, in agreement with those selections. And then I would give him 2 and 3 versions of the songs, and he called me up and said, I like this one, don't like that one. And we went with his selections wherever possible. At the last minute, we wound up not using the Greek Theater 85 version of She Belongs to Me because of a technical glitch in the recording. We went with the Chula Vista one, which was my first choice anyway. But it was very, very much a collaborative process. A lot of people with big ears contributed to this.
Start outstanding, proud to steal anything she sees. You start outstanding, proud to steal anything she sees.
Let's talk a little bit about the relationship between Dylan and the Dead. Not just the one that transpired when they wound up meeting each other, working together, but sort of a synergistic one that existed way back in the folk era when they were both of that generation of musicians who were picking up tunes from Harry Smith's Anthology of American Folk Music and exploring what Greil Marcus called the Old Weird America. Michael Gilmore, who wrote wonderful liner notes for the album, discusses that to some extent in his notes, and wanted to get your comments on that process.
Well, Dylan and the Dead came from the folk world and from the era when the song was the thing. There was rock and roll, and there was folk music, and there were various little side trips into jug band music and stuff like that. But really what it's all about is the song. And Bob Dylan is the greatest songwriter of our generation, I think, and he's got some pretty stiff competition. But I think there was something about Dylan's tunes that all the guys in the Dead could relate to. Phil Lesh told me in a 1981 interview about driving a mail truck in San Francisco and having a decidedly illicit transistor radio on his dashboard of the van while he was doing this. And he said that he heard Subterranean Homesick Blues on KFRC, the top 40 station. He said, "F me, that's Bob Dylan on the radio." And he said, I pulled over and I forgot about my route and I just sat there and listened to it, and it was the greatest thing. And he said, they must have thought so too at the station because they played it like 3 times an hour for the rest of the day. And Jerry told Blair Jackson and me in an interview around that same time, that Dylan just had that way of just hitting that nail on the head, particularly that Blonde on Blonde era. There was a certain sort of bitterness that he put across so very well in songs like Positively 4th Street. The psychedelic imagery of the stuff that he was doing fit perfectly with the Grateful Dead's mentality, I think. And also, my own personal observation is that Dylan's tunes describe a landscape that is very much like ours, but also very much his own. But very much the same way Grateful Dead music does, you can sort of project yourself into that world and make it fit, make yourself fit into it somehow, or make it fit into your world. Listening to Bob Dylan songs as performed by the Grateful Dead, I always heard these lines coming out of there that related directly to things that were going on in the Grateful Dead world, in my own life and stuff. You know, that's one of the things that I like most, or that makes a song great, as far as I'm concerned, is that thing of universalizing the personal and personalizing the universal. And Dylan had a way of making stuff that was so utterly his own, and yet so completely universal, global. You know, so it's not even slightly surprising that as savvy a performer and songwriter as Jerry Garcia would connect deeply with Bob Dylan, or that Bob Weir would find stuff in there that worked for him as the very different kind of singer that he is. And that's another thing that really needs to be brought up. That material worked for everybody. Phil didn't do very many Dylan tunes, but Phil would sing just like Tom Thumb's Blues, which sort of fit his character in a way. I called it droll, you called it sardonic, both work. It's each guy checking in from his corner of that world, and the Dylan tunes that work for Jerry and the Dylan tunes that work for Weir are different ones, but they both work equally well.
And interestingly, they're almost, because of the interpretation, they're different songs in a way than from when Dylan did them. I mean, I always thought Desolation Row, you know, Dylan sings it with just the most sardonic, again, that word, sardonic, sort of an end of the world quality to it. Weir is more like an innocent abroad in that song, I think.
You know, one time I heard a tape of either the first or one of the very first performances of Desolation Row at Forest Hills. Uh-huh. I don't know what year that was, 65 maybe, somewhere back there. And one of the things that knocked me out about it was how much laughter there was in the audience. And I happened to be sitting with Greil Marcus at the time. I was transferring this tape for him. And I expressed this to him, and he said, oh, this stuff was just hilarious in those days. And it's funny because by the time it hit the Grateful Dead stage, the times were so different and the setting was so different that I think it took on a lot more urgency in Bobby's universe than it did in the place that Dylan was singing it from back in the day.
Well, I think there was also, you know, there was almost a quasi-religious quality attributed to Dylan at a certain point, you know, especially during that period when he was absent from the scene after the motorcycle accident, and just mythology about him grew up. And I think people started to miss the humor in the music a lot. You know, there was all this meta-analysis of the lyrics and, you know, what does it all mean? But some of those songs are indeed hilarious, and some of them are some of the most sarcastic music ever written. And some of it's also full of rage and full of passion. There's so much stuff going on there.
That's a very good point about how seriously Dylan was taken for a long time there, and how seriously he's still taken. I think one of the ways that Jerry Garcia and Bob Dylan connected was that they both were the victims of their own greatness on a certain level. That they were both taken so very, very seriously by people that they began to be wary of every utterance. I heard that, you know, Jerry told that to somebody way, way back as early as like 1968, that he stopped talking on stage so much because so much of what he said was taken so very seriously. I mean, he didn't say nothing at all, but it did reach a point where he measured his words very carefully and wouldn't make the same kind of jokes and stuff that he did in the earlier days, because a lot of people did tend to take things and run with them, you know. So I think that was part of the thing that drew Jerry and Bob close when they started hanging out together in the 80s and when they were doing the rehearsals for the tour and stuff. Which, by the way, leads me to deliver the very good news that we got a song from the rehearsals to use on the record. This project also had a lot of help and support from Bob Dylan and his organization. We were given permission to go through the rehearsals from May and June of 1987 and find one track from there that was particularly noteworthy. I found dozens of things that were really good and should be on a record someday. And if I get my druthers, someday we'll do a CD of material from the rehearsals. But we were allowed to choose one, and I sent a bunch of things to Jeff Rosen, who's Dylan's business manager in New York, and he narrowed it down to like two things, and we wound up using Man of Peace from a rehearsal in June of '87 as the 11th track on this record. And to my great delight, Jeff also gave me permission to use a couple of the other things from the rehearsals on this radio show.
Oh, great.
So we have, and there were, the rehearsals were phenomenal. They went through tons and tons of material, not just Dylan's tunes, but the Dead showed them. There's just a snippet of this, which I won't get to play on the radio, but I did hear going by just a 30-second passage of Franklin's Tower with Dylan playing harmonica on it, things like that. And there was a hilarious conversation where they're doing that, and I think there was a little bit of Fire on the Mountain also, and you hear somebody say, oh yeah, we got a mess of these songs that are only like 2 chords, they're real easy. And Dylan saying, yeah, let's hear some more of those.
Yeah, you really get a palpable sense of the shared affinities during those sessions, because there's that sitting on the back porch picking feel to it, like, let's try this one. Remember that one?
Yeah. Well, one thing you'll be hearing in this program is Stealin', which of course was one of the first recordings the Dead ever made. It might have been the first single they ever made as the Grateful Dead.
And it was in the Mother McCree's Uptown Jug Champions book as well.
That's right. Well, Dylan knew it, and there's a story, there's a version of it that I think is circulating on the bootleg CDs of the rehearsals with David Nelson playing mandolin. But a couple days later, they revisited that song with Dylan himself playing mandolin.
You run around me like a circle around the sun. Won't you love me right or like my easy rider? You don't believe I love you. Look what a fool I've been. Don't believe I'm sinking. Look what a hole I'm in. Stealing, pretty mama, don't you tell on me. Well, I'm stealing back to my same old used to be.
I couldn't find Stealin' in my collection.
Oh, God.
I've got a couple other drug band tunes on a tape that I made, but
Is that too fast for that tune?
that's a little too fast, yeah.
Stealin', an unreleased rehearsal performance by Bob Dylan and the Grateful Dead, recorded in June of 1987 at the Dead Studio in San Rafael, California, with Bob Dylan playing mandolin. You've been listening to Gary Lambert and me talking about Postcards of the Hanging. Grateful Dead performed the songs of Bob Dylan, released March 19th on Grateful Dead Records. Stay tuned for some more unreleased Dylan Dead rehearsal material when the Grateful Dead Hour continues. You're listening to the Grateful Dead Hour. Now I'd like you to hear some unreleased material from the June 1987 rehearsals for the Dylan Dead Tour. Very special thanks to Bob Dylan for allowing me to play this stuff for you.
All my love, all my kissing, you don't know what you've been missing, oh boy. When you're with me, oh boy, I want the world to see that you were meant for me. All my life I've been waiting, tonight there'll be no hesitation, oh boy. When you're with me, oh boy, I want the world to see that you were meant for me. The shadows falling, you can hear my heart calling. Little, little love, make everything right. I wanna see my baby tonight. All my life I've been waiting. Tonight there'll be no hesitation, oh boy. When you're with me, oh boy, I want the world to see that you were meant for me. Dumpty, dumpty, dump, oh boy. Dumpty, dumpty, dump, oh boy.
Son of mine, I'm glad you're a son of mine. There is no I doing what you dare. Living us so tall, and your uniform and all. Your parents first break out into a grid. you know. Everything was understood. Write a letter once in a while, both spoke in a smile. Over the people door next door. And she bragged about her son with his uniform and gun. Everything will call a Russian war. Then the letter ceased to come. For a long time they did not come. They ceased to come for about 10 months or more. When later finally came, saying go down and meet the train. Cause they're coming home from the war. She smiled and went right down. She looked everywhere around. Now she been a stranger on an aid. When all the people passed, she saw her son and laughed. She not believe her eyes. Tell me, darling son, pray tell me what they've done. How come you come to be this way? He tried his best to talk. His mouth could hardly move. His mother had to turn her face away. Don't you remember, Mom, when I went off to war? You thought it was the best thing I could do. I was on the battleground. You were home at your foul. There wasn't standing there in my shoe. God, what am I doing here? I'm trying to kill somebody, would I try? But the thing that scared me most was my enemy get blues. I saw that his head was just like mine. Oh, I could not have but much. I felt the rolling steam, and I was just a puppet in a play. Oh, the roaring smoke, I sprang and finally broke, and a cannonball that blew my eyes away. Turned away to walk, his ma was still in shock. His spell around and race that helped him stand. As he turned to go, they caught his mother close, and he dropped his medals down into her hand. I hear that train coming, rolling around the bend. I ain't seen the sunshine since I don't know when. I'm stuck in Folsom Prison. Time keeps dragging on, but that train keeps rolling on down the street. When I was just a baby, my mama told me, son, always be a good boy, don't ever play with guns. But I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die. When I hear that train a-blowing, I hang my head and cry. Well, I bet there's rich fatiguing in a fancy dining car, probably drinking coffee, smoking big cigars. But I know I had it coming. I know I can't be free. But those people keep it moving, and that's what tortures me. From this business, if this railroad train was mine, that I'd move it on a little further down the line. Five floors in prison, that's where I want to stay. And I let that lonesome whistle blow my blues away. Might be a complete professor standing in the rain. Might be a conductor looking on the train. You might be rich or poor, baby. Might be a conductor standing on the side. Might be
I did too.
Might be good just the way landing on the rain. Champion of the world. You might be rich or poor, maybe blind or dead. Another country, another day. Serve somebody. Serve somebody. Serve somebody. It might be the devil. It might be the Lord, but you serve somebody. Serve somebody. You might be busy standing on the rain. You might be on the train. You might be rich or poor, blind or lame, living in another country, under another name, but you serve somebody. Serve somebody. Serve Might be sleeping in a pantry under a feather bed. He fed in a trolley and I think she said, but you'll serve somebody. Serve somebody. You're gonna serve somebody. Serve somebody. That might mean the devil, that might mean the Lord, but you'll serve somebody. Serve somebody.
Bob Dylan and the Grateful Dead from the rehearsals for their 1987 tour. You heard Buddy Holly's Oh Boy with Bob on harmonica, John Brown, Johnny Cash's Folsom Prison Blues with Bob Dylan and Jerry Garcia singing, Gotta Serve Somebody, and finally Bob Dylan singing C.C. Rider while Jerry played the Freddie King instrumental Hideaway on the guitar. All of this material is unreleased, heard on the radio now for the first and only time. The CD we were talking about earlier is called Postcards of the Hanging. Grateful Dead perform the songs of Bob Dylan, with 10 of the Dead's Dylan covers, plus Bob and the Dead doing Man of Peace from the rehearsals. The first press run includes a bonus CD with Queen Jane Approximately and Quinn the Eskimo. This compilation was produced by me, David Gans, and I sure hope you like it. And now here are some scenes from next week's Grateful Dead Hour.
She wore scarlet magnolias tucked into her curls. Here's a cry for that woman, got her bloody ribbon. Now the die is shaking, now the die must fall.
I'm going to be doing my solo electric thing in the Midwest in May, and I'll be performing in other parts of the country later this year. The schedule is posted at www.dgans.com. The Grateful Dead Hour webpage is at www.gdhour.com. This has been Grateful Dead Hour number 705. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. I'm David Gans, and I'll meet you back here next week.
She wore scarlet magnolias tucked into her curls. Here's a cry for that woman, got her bloody ribbon. Now the die is shaking, now the die must fall.
This week on the Grateful Dead Hour, we'll get started on set 2 of July 25th, 1974.